When I would hear the old adage, right place at the right time, I'd think to myself, yeah, okay, it's all just coincidence. But after what I've been through these past 6 weeks, my mind is changing. Maybe you are put in a specific place at a specific time for a reason, but I digress. As most of you know, the Pacific Northwest, for those unfamiliar, was recently ravaged by an ungodly amount of wildfires. Seeing all the little fire emojis dotted all over maps of California, Oregon, and Washington made my heart ache. My home was burning. Fortunately for myself and my family, our area hadn't been hit as hard as many others. I had planned a camping trip a few weeks prior to this pandemic of wildfires, so I was happy to see that my usual spot was not near any major fires and subsequently had been deemed safe to travel and camp in. I am a camping enthusiast, enjoy deep wilderness camping, and my usual spot is fairly remote. It requires a 2-hour drive up a 2-lane road into the middle of nowhere, followed by a 30-minute drive up an old logging road that ultimately crests a small mountain. The mountain slope leads into a beautiful valley, with much larger mountains encircling the valley from the north and east. In the center was a decently sized clearing. The clearing was littered with fallen logs, beautiful pink and yellow yarrow flowers, and the occasional family of white-tailed deer. This was my true happy place. This valley has a name, but I will keep it hidden for anonymity purposes. I left on a Tuesday morning in early September. The drive to the mountain was relatively uneventful, besides almost hitting a large buck who decided to cross the road right in front of my truck. I arrived on the mountain's crest and began unpacking the bed of my truck. I had just recently bought a new 2020 Toyota Tacoma. I parked my truck facing the clearing, roughly 5 feet from the edge of a small drop-off. The slope down to the valley wasn't steep and is fairly easy to hike down. I'd say it's about 400 to 450 feet from where I parked down to the start of the valley floor. I had camp set up just as dusk was setting. I usually would have a large fire going, but with the previously mentioned wildfires, that wasn't possible. I brought a small propane stove and a space heater to prevent any accidents. As I finished gulping down my last bite of dinner, I noticed it was quickly growing dark. I hopped off my tailgate and made my way to my driver's side door. As I was digging in my pockets for my keys, I looked down into the valley and noticed something strange. I could make out 2 small circular lights in the far distance. They flickered as they quickly moved closer to the clearing. It looked as if though they were hovering and navigating through the trees at a steady pace. I crouched down in front of my truck and looked on in curiosity. I watched for a few minutes until the lights eventually arrived at the tree line of the clearing. I could hear the humming of motorcycle engines echoing from the valley, and that's when I realized that that's what I was staring at. What on earth were these 2 people doing riding dirt bikes out here? This was the first time I had ever seen another person out here. The lights were stationary at this point. I assumed the 2 riders were off their bikes and walking around the clearing, although this is only speculation as I couldn't see anything aside from the 2 bike headlights. I knew they couldn't see me as I had no visible lights on or a campfire going, and I instantly thought to grab my phone out of my glove box. Local news stations warned the public of suspected people intentionally starting fires in the woods. They encouraged citizens to be vigilant and gather any evidence they could. In an absolute lapse in judgment, I pressed the unlock button on my keys. My truck lights flashed and a loud beeping sound rang out. I had just given a beacon of my location to these midnight riders. In a rush of adrenaline, I threw myself onto the ground stomach first. My mind was screaming, "Good going, Einstein." I could barely think as my heart was pounding in my ears. I watched as the bike lights began to turn back into the direction they came from and eventually disappeared into the darkness. I could hear the engines revving harder than they had before. That unsettled me a bit. As I stood up and brushed myself off, I began thinking about how odd it was. Usually people with good intentions do not run off like that when they notice other campers. These people were obviously up to no good down there. Maybe drug traffickers, meth cookers, arsonists. My mind was filled with all the potential threats I might have alerted to my location. I sat in my truck and mulled over my options. Should I drive home? What if they were waiting for me at the end of the logging road? Was I overreacting? I decided to pack up camp and spend the night in my truck and drive home first thing in the morning. After packing everything up, I drove down the logging road a little ways and backed into a small gap in the mountain face. That way, if the midnight riders decided to pay me a visit, they might miss me. I was in full paranoia mode. I lowered my seat back, racked around in my handgun, and eventually dozed off as the adrenaline turned into exhaustion. I awoke to my alarm, with my Life for Hire by ADTR blaring from my phone. In a groggy daze, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. My phone said 6:32 a.m. I looked out my windshield. I could see thick brown smoke swirling in the wind. As I stepped out of my truck, I was hit with the intense smell of burning wood. So as you guessed, there was a fire very close by. I jumped back into my truck and raced back up the mountain. From my camping spot, I'd be able to get a better understanding of the situation. As I drove way too fast up this narrow logging road, I noticed the smoke was thinning out as my elevation grew. My heart sank at this realization. When I reached the crest, I jumped into the truck bed and looked out over the valley. I could see blue skies above the mountains across from me to the north and east. My heart sank as this confirmed my suspicion. I turned toward the logging road to my right. I could see the smoke thicken from that direction. I was trapped. My mind instantly went to the two riders from the previous night. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. Of course, no such luck. I jumped off my truck bed and threw my passenger door open. I frantically searched for my backpack. I ripped it apart, once I found it, looking for my GPS satellite phone. I kissed it with joy when I grabbed it from the bottom of the bag. I flipped it open and thanked the Lord I had a signal. I called 911 to report the fire and request help, and I chatted with the operator for about 15 minutes. The operator said she'd contact local wildland firefighting companies and attempt to get a helicopter to evacuate me. After being on hold for a few minutes, I was transferred to a helicopter pilot with a wildland firefighting company that was nearby. I mentioned the valley by name, and the man said he knew where it was. He claimed that they were sending a helicopter to pick me up and that I needed to be there and ready to leave as soon as they landed. After we disconnected, I rushed to clear out my truck of any valuables. I sadly rubbed the dashboard and said sorry to my new truck, as it was evident the fire would eventually consume her. I then gradually started making my way down the slope and into the valley. After only falling a few times, I reached the valley floor. I bolted through the trees and toward the clearing. My lungs were on fire as I neared the clearing. As I broke through the tree line, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. After a few minutes of laying there, catching my breath, I got back onto my feet. I started walking towards the center of the clearing. When I got to what I assumed was the center, I glanced up at the peak of the small mountain, and I could see my bright red truck sitting where I left it. Roughly 200 feet to the left of it was a wall of fire. Black smoke was rising from the wall as it raced up the mountain. I turned away, not wanting to watch my $39,000 literally go up in flames. I began scanning the skies, searching for my rescue. I concentrated on listening for the chopping sound of the helicopter's rotors. As I stood there listening, I heard something else that made me question my sanity. Just to my left, I could hear someone crying. A shockwave ran through me. I stood there, unable to believe my ears. I upholstered my handgun and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" I then began to hear muffled screaming. I ran towards the screaming, trying to hold back tears. I noticed a piece of plywood roughly 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, covered in branches and dirt. It was laying on the ground with a large boulder set on top. I called out, "Hello?" I heard the muffled scream again, this time much louder and unmistakable. Is someone really under this plywood? I thought to myself. I rushed to move the boulder. After struggling for a few minutes, I finally managed to push the boulder off the plywood. I slowly lifted it up and threw it to the side. What I saw is something I will never forget. Sitting inside a small hole, probably no bigger than 4 feet by 4 feet, was a woman. Her wrists were zip-tied and her mouth was gagged with a piece of cloth. I gasped and took a step back. I couldn't believe it. What was going on? The woman was frantically looking around. I snapped out of my shock and rushed to help her. She flinched as I reached out to grab her. I lifted her out of the hole. I took the cloth from her mouth and she frantically started yelling in Spanish and raising her arms. I told her to calm down. You're safe now. I cut the zip ties that were binding her wrists. She instantly started pointing behind me and repeating, Mia, Mia. I didn't understand her as unfortunately I knew no Spanish. I turned around quickly to see 4 more pieces of plywood scattered across the clearing. I was horrified. I rushed over and started flipping them over one by one, and one by one they were empty. The woman following me as I did this let out a painful cry as I flipped the last piece of plywood, exposing a 4th and final empty hole. She collapsed on the ground and began sobbing. I tried to ask what was wrong, but I couldn't understand her. As I attempted to console her, I could hear the distinct sound of helicopter rotors. I looked up to see the chopper descending into the valley. I helped the woman out and put her arm over my shoulder as we rushed to the awaiting chopper. A man jumped out from the side doors. When we reached him, he helped the woman in, then stopped and yelled at me that you didn't tell us that there would be 2 of you. I yelled back, trying to be heard over the loud rotors. I just found her. I had no idea what is happening. He replied with, You found her? What are you... Never mind, we don't have time. Get in. He helped me into the helicopter and shut the doors. Soon after we started to ascend, I looked down over the valley to see the fire had engulfed the peak and was halfway down the slope towards the valley. I sat back in relief. I was finally safe, but I had so many questions. The state police and EMTs met us when we landed back at the base camp. I explained the entire situation, and they took the woman and I back to the station. Eventually, I was released after retelling my story to 6 different officers. My wife picked me up, and I was able to return home. And that wasn't the end, unfortunately. Over these last 6 weeks, I was interviewed by local authorities, state authorities, the U.S. Marshals, ICE, and even a pair of FBI agents. My final interview was with the 2 FBI agents. They were the only ones who gave me any real information on the situation. After retelling my story, just as I did here, they filled in some holes for me. They explained that I most likely stumbled upon a human trafficking operation. When I unlocked my truck, it spooked them. He said I was lucky that I hid in that gap when I did, as they most likely went up the logging road to handle me. When they couldn't locate me, they probably assumed that I had left to get the police. So they packed up any valuable assets, including the woman's young daughter, and started the fire to destroy any evidence before I could alert the authorities. I asked about the girl. The older agent informed me that her and her daughter were kidnapped from Nicaragua. The woman claimed that they were set to be sold to a wealthy Russian oligarch. She was being held in government custody until she can be returned home. He then said, She's lucky you came along when you did. You were at the right place, at the right time. This story takes place 2 years ago, when I was living in the same house as my 2 younger sisters and my father. We lived in a neighborhood that wasn't necessarily unsafe, but wasn't the best neighborhood for people to live in. I can recall some neighbors getting arrested for dealing when I was maybe 5, but the story isn't about them. In the summer of 2018, my sisters and I would stay up late into the night, sometimes only going to bed after the sun had risen. I was 17 and my sisters were 15 and 13. My father would go to bed early, as he was a responsible adult. To explain the situation best, I need to describe what my house looked like. It was a 1-story home with 4 doors on the front of my house, 3 of which opened to our living room, and 1 of which opened to my bedroom. Our backyard fence had been knocked down by a storm recently, and we had 2 doors on the back of the house, one that opened to the kitchen, and one that opened to my father's room. One night at around 12:30 a.m., I was doing what I usually did. I was listening to scary stories on my phone as I made art on my iPad. I didn't use earbuds because I've always been paranoid that something might happen while I'm using them. My sisters, who shared a room down the hall from me, were doing whatever they did at night. It didn't really concern me. My father was fast asleep in his room. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I always end up very on edge when I'm listening to scary stories, so I'm hyper-aware of what's going on around me. You can imagine how hard I jumped when I heard a sharp pounding on our front door. 4 hard thuds could be heard throughout the house, and I could hear the front door shake with the strength of each knock. I checked the time, terrified. It was 1 a.m. I held my breath, hoping to God that I'd heard wrong. I really didn't want to think someone was at my front door. At this moment, my middle sister Jen came running to my room, trying to keep her steps silent. She looked at me, eyes wild. "You heard that too, right?" she asked, voice trembling. I swallowed and nodded, heart pounding in my chest. "We need to go wake Dad up," I responded and started towards my father's bedroom. Julia followed diligently behind me. On our way to our dad's room, my youngest sister Ness peeked her head out from her room. She too looked scared. I opened my dad's door and shook him awake, trembling slightly. One of my worst fears is someone breaking into our house. "Dad, someone's at the front door." Even as I said this, I felt sick. "What?" Dad whispered, groggy and not at all happy that we had woken him. "There's someone here," Jen whispered. "I heard it. Someone knocked on the door." I nodded all too eagerly. My dad slowly got out of bed. He knew that my sisters and I always jumped to the worst conclusions whenever anything happened, so he assumed we were doing the same here. I watched silently as he went to the front door, my stomach leaping to my throat. "There's no one out there," he told my sisters and I, absolutely unimpressed as he looked through the blinds. My heart sank a little. I kind of started to doubt myself, but my sisters had heard the knocking too, so I knew I wasn't alone in this. I tried to reason with him before he went back to bed, but he didn't believe us, too scared to really care what we were saying. Dejected but scared, I ended up taking my mattress off my bed and sleeping in my sister's room for the night, taking a baseball bat and lying it next to my mattress. My overactive imagination had me thinking that whoever was at the door was out to kill us, and I knew I have to defend my younger sisters against any danger that dared enter our house. The next day passed just fine. My sisters and I knew we had heard something, and our dad brushed off our attempts to explain it. He thought we were sleep-deprived, or perhaps that a large bug had hit our door. That explanation I had frowned at. It wasn't until 11 p.m. that night, when my father was lounging on one of the couches in the living room, that we heard the pounding again. Only this time it was much more aggressive and directly on the door behind my father. My father let out a loud, frustrated scream and charged toward the front door. I had been standing in the living room when the pounding occurred again, and my sisters had rushed to stand next to me after hearing my father shout. We were all shaken. Our father never yelled like that. I started to cry as my father went to rush outside and confront whoever was out there. I begged him not to go outside in case he were to get hurt. He told my sisters and I to call the cops, and he cursed some more when he realized that whoever had knocked on the door was now gone. My sisters called the cops, and they arrived fairly quickly, talking with my dad about what was going on, claiming that there had been other complaints about this happening, and explaining that they would try their best to find out who was doing this. The police did a search around our house but didn't find anyone, even searching the backyard where I was afraid the perpetrator might be. The police assured us that someone would patrol the neighborhood that night. Once the cops were gone, my dad apologized for not believing us the night before. We said it was okay and left it at that. He locked all of the doors and stayed up later than my sisters and I. I couldn't calm down, so I slept in my sister's room that night as well. Eventually, though, I put this situation behind me. A few months had passed, but not without nightmares and sleep paralysis about the whole ordeal. Most nightmares ended with someone breaking in and hurting my sisters. Other nightmares ended in more brutal ways. I thought nothing more of the whole ordeal. This is until one day I came home from school, and Ness ran up to me, buzzing with energy. She proceeded to tell me that apparently the cops had found out who was knocking on everyone's door about a month or so ago. It was some older guy who lived a few houses down from us. They had gotten him to stop, and I'm not sure if he was given a warning or something. He was a little unstable mentally, and nobody had ever opened their doors for him. Ness then told me that the same guy had been arrested earlier this day. I was shocked. He'd only been knocking on people's doors at odd hours of the night. I asked her why he'd been arrested. He shot and killed 15 people one town over, she responded. I couldn't believe it, but my father later confirmed this story. I'm happy to say that he is in jail and no longer lives in that neighborhood. I haven't done any more looking into his crime other than trying to confirm it for myself the day he was arrested. I'm also happy to say that after another recent event where someone tried to break into our house, my father installed a Ring doorbell, the doorbell with a camera, which gave my sisters and I some comfort. I hope this man gets what he deserves, or maybe that he gets the help he needs if he really truly is completely insane. I also hope that the families affected by this man's actions are able to find some form of closure in knowing that he's locked away for what he's done. This happened a few years back when I had just gotten hired at the local grocery store in my city. I was 16 at the time and definitely looked my age, if not younger. It's also important to mention that I'm quite a shy person as is, especially back then at my new workplace. I had been working there for a while when our store hired a new cashier. For this story, I'll call him Joseph. Overall, Joseph seemed pretty nice. He was always waving hello to everyone, greeting everyone at the start of his shift. Just fit in pretty well and seemed like a fairly normal guy, trying his best to befriend his coworkers. After a few months of working there, Joseph started trying to talk to me more frequently. This didn't seem weird, as cashiers tend to get close to anyone that they frequently work the same hours as. It's always nice to have someone to have short conversations with when the store gets quiet. It did escalate pretty quickly, with him going out of his way to talk to me about any chance he got, but again, he was fairly new and I assumed he was just being friendly. This changed one day as I'm getting off of work and he approached me as I was exiting the store and asked if I would like to get coffee with him. I was caught extremely off guard by this, and due to being shy and an anxious person, I stammered out a quick, yeah, sure. Immediately regretting this in my head as I had zero attraction to Joseph, before I quickly ran out of the store to where my parents were waiting to pick me up. That day when I got home, I searched his profile on Facebook to see if I could find out more about him. It turns out Joseph wasn't actually as young as I assumed he was. He was 26 years old at this time. At this point, I will also mention that it was a known fact between all cashiers that me and a handful of other cashiers were all in high school. So knowing that I wasn't going to entertain the idea of coffee with him, the next day at work when I saw him, I told him that I wouldn't be able to get coffee with him as the age difference was too much for me. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to deter Joseph, who simply replied, "Does age matter to you? It doesn't matter to me." I replied with a quick, "Well, when you're almost 30 and I'm in high school, it matters a bit." This comment seemed to go unnoticed as he stated how he would wait for me and how he could make me happy. This obviously creeped me out, and from then on I began to avoid Joseph as best as I could. However, he began to become very persistent. Every single shift I had, he either happened to be working already or would go through my till to buy a single item and continue to pester me for a date, asking me almost daily, "Have you changed your mind?" and telling me that he wasn't giving up. This may not seem like much for those reading, but being harassed daily by an older man in an environment where you were supposed to be safe was terrifying for me. I admit if this had taken place now, I would have totally gone to HR or my manager and told them about the situation, but as a 16-year-old girl working her first job, I feared that I was overreacting. Eventually, after at least a couple of months of honestly being scared to go to work, I confided in a friend that I worked with that it was happening. This friend happened to be a huge 6-foot-tall man who said that he would talk to Joseph about his creepy behavior. Around the same time, I also told one of Joseph's closer friends at our workplace about his behavior and how it was upsetting me. And around this time, Joseph began to leave me alone, shortly after leaving the store entirely. I actually began to forget all about this until a year or so ago after it all happened, when I got a message from an old work friend who I don't typically talk to. Her message simply stated, "Did you see this?" and had a link below. The link was a mugshot from the Crime Stoppers unit in our town, a mugshot of Joseph, underneath which it said that there was a province-wide warrant out for his arrest for the charges of possession and distribution of illicit images containing children. I don't know what I avoided by not going out for coffee with him, and I can't say with certainty that anything would have happened, but boy am I glad my warning bells went off when they did. This is a post about my creepy experience when I was 13 on my trip to China. As a little background, I am now 21, 6'2". When I was 13, I was about 5'5", so I didn't really stand out, but about average. My family and I went to China during the summer. We went to Shanghai. We stayed there for the duration of our trip. And one day I found myself on the subway coming back from a movie with my friend that lives here. His house was right near the movie theater, so we parted ways earlier. I know, I should have been with my parents, but I have always been independent. I was sitting on a seat in the subway on my phone looking at Instagram. I also must mention that I was and still am a redhead, which is very rare in China, and this will be relevant later. I was on the subway when a man comes onto the subway. An Asian man with black hair, probably about 5'8". He was taller than me, but not by much. At first, I didn't pay him any mind, but I slowly noticed he was getting closer to me. When he first came in, he was about 10 seats away from me, and now he was about 5. As he slowly was advancing, he was staring daggers at me, so I was like, okay, this guy's a little creepy, but I stupidly shrugged it off. I had 2 stops left till I got off. Now my parents raised me to show respect and politeness to everyone until you have a reason not to, and I've not been able to use this to my advantage. Whenever I witness someone being bullied, or whenever I have been, I'm very polite and it throws them off. So by now, this man is only 2 seats away from me. I said to myself, when this dude sits next to me, I'll engage with him. So, soon enough, he sat next to me, staring. I say, "Are you okay, sir?" And this threw the man off. He didn't respond, but stopped staring. He expected me to be scared, so I thought that was that, but boy was I wrong. Soon enough, my stop comes, I get off, and then my friend over here gets off also. And at first I said, okay, maybe he's at the stop also. And my family and I had a condo a couple of blocks away, so I started walking, and this idiot follows me. I start jogging, and so does he. So then I have the opportunity to make a split decision. I can take the alleyway and I'll be about 2 minutes from the condo, or I could take the long way that is populated. My dumb 13-year-old self took the alleyway. I full-out sprint, but this guy is at least 6 foot and I'm 5'5", and he catches me. He pins me to the floor and is about to inject me with something in a syringe. When I get lucky and I'm able to knee him in the balls, he doubles over and I escape. I tell my parents and they absolutely lose their mind, and we call the police. All I'm able to do is give a statement, and they say they'll keep an eye out for him. I don't know the whereabouts of that man still to this day. I'm still thinking about why this man wanted me, and I looked up some of the top crimes in China, and one of the top ones I found is human trafficking. Do you guys think that this guy was potentially part of some greater ring of traffickers? I live with my mom, dad, younger brother, and our dog in a very rural area in Bavaria in Germany. When this happened, I was about 13 years old, and we don't have any close neighbors. It was a very cold Saturday in December. I remember the day because my mother worked only on Saturdays. My brother, father, and I spent our afternoons watching movies. In fact, we watched one of the Narnia movies, and it was close to 5 p.m. at this point. Since it was winter, it was nearly getting dark outside. The room was only lit by the TV and our fireplace. At one point, my brother looked outside the window because it started to snow heavily. We all looked outside the window when, all of a sudden, my dog began to growl. He ran up and down the room, very alert. This was very unusual for him to do so. My dad stood up and looked around, but he didn't see anything. After a few minutes, he began to calm down again. We returned to our movie, and everything was fine for a few minutes. Then he started doing it again. I noticed my brother was staring out the window next to our back door. I asked him what he saw, and he shook his head. Then all of a sudden, we saw an old lady approaching our back door. We were baffled because hardly anyone comes out here, especially not an old woman like her. She looked to be around 80 to 90 years old, wearing one of those typical grandma aprons and a headscarf. Now mind you, it's about -10 degrees Celsius outside. She tapped on the back door glass and started to smile really weird. Meanwhile, my dog hid under the table, whimpering and growling. My brother came close to me and my dad walked to the back door and opened it a bit. In a confused tone, he asked what she was doing in our backyard. She smiled and looked directly at us, not even noticing my dad. She took a step forward to the door, shoving her foot into the crack of the door, and my dad immediately shut the door closed. She glared at him and then at us before she started to laugh maniacally. Then she just calmly walked away like nothing had happened. We looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what to say. My brother and I looked outside the window behind us, and we couldn't see her. The only way in and out of our backyard was this small path next to the house. From the window behind us, we must have seen her leaving, but she didn't pass by that window. My dad stepped outside and couldn't see her anymore. Neither could he see any footprints in the snow. There was absolutely no way the tracks would have been covered by snow already, since only a couple of minutes had passed between her leaving and my dad going outside. To this day, we don't know what we had encountered that day. I don't know if this was anything paranormal or not. It may not seem too creepy to you, but to us kids, this was the most terrifying thing we'd ever witnessed. About 5 years ago, my family took a trip to see Mom's childhood friend. I was about 15 years old at the time, not super long ago. I'm going to avoid any obnoxious introductions so I can just tell the story. I think we left at around the afternoon. It takes about 3 hours to get there, from one side of Arizona to another side, but we make it with no problems. We stay there for about 2 days. Again, no problems. The problems occurred on our way back. We had 2 dogs that we took with us, and so naturally we needed to stop every so often to let them go to the bathroom, stretch their legs, etc. The first part of the drive was fine, no problems whatsoever. Later we're driving through a small town in northern Arizona, and we took a back road to avoid holiday traffic. The layout of this road was simple. On one side you had your standard apartments, and on the other side you had an empty lot surrounded by forest, empty like they were planning on putting more apartments there. My mom saw it and said something like, "We should take the dogs over there." My dad was driving and my little sisters were small, so it was up to me and my twin brother to take the dogs out because we were strong 15-year-old boys. My brother hands me one of his earbuds so we can listen to music and starts walking. We were walking maybe 5 minutes when me and my brother decided to take the dogs to some bushes behind a tree so they could relieve themselves. As we were waiting for them to go, we see a body, which looks like it was covered in blood. The body looked like your typical homeless person's stereotype of tattered clothes and long beard, but it's just covered from head to toe in blood, like someone had dipped it in blood like you dip a chocolate-covered strawberry. My brother and I are freaking out, so we run back to the car and tell our dad. He follows us back to the bush that we saw it, but there was nobody there. It just vanished. My dad, understandably, was very livid, yelled at me for almost giving him a heart attack, and storms off. Nothing happened after that. We were pretty shaken up after. Me and my brother had a lot to talk about what happened, and neither of us were believers in the paranormal, but we are now. How else did the body disappear just like that? There's just no logical explanation. Now, this story starts the day after I moved into my new home. I had just moved from my apartment, which was in a bad neighborhood with lots of bad things happening there, but that's another story. So I had just moved into my new house, a small 2-bedroom house. The kitchen was right in front of the master bedroom, and the secondary bedroom was right off of the living room. I had my mother and 2 siblings living with me. They took the very large master while I took the secondary bedroom. Anyways, this encounter took place pretty late in the night at around 11 p.m. Everyone had gone to sleep, so I was pretty excited that I got the house to myself. I decided that I would do the dishes to help my mother out, and then play some games on my Xbox for the rest of the night. I walked into the kitchen with my dog and started doing up the dishes. About halfway through them, I started feeling really uneasy. I started thinking it was just an unexpected anxiety attack, which I get pretty often, so I didn't really think much of it. I paused and decided that maybe a glass of water would help. While I was sipping my water, I started to hear my dog growling from the living room. I say to my dog, but he is really my mother's dog. He is a very, very good guard dog, and will destroy any intruder in a heartbeat type of guard dog. Anyways, I heard him growling, a very low, quiet growl. Me, being the stupid 17-year-old that I am, decided I was going to go see what he was doing. I put down my glass and walked into the living room where both my puppy and my mother's dog were standing by the front door, their nose in the crack of it. I tiptoed my way up to the door and listened carefully. All I heard was a faint scratching noise, so I assumed it was just a raccoon or one of the stray cats that frequented our house because we always leave our cat food out for them. I took a peek out of the front window, which is located right beside the door, and didn't see anything, just the dark yard and porch illuminated softly by the glow of the street light in front of the house. So I told the dogs to chill out before they woke the family up. After they settled down a bit, I went back to finish up the dishes and think about what games I was going to play. As I was washing a plate, I got that uneasy feeling again, the feeling in the pit of your stomach that just feels like something is very wrong. I tried brushing it off, but it was coming on so strong. All of a sudden I got the feeling as though someone was behind me, staring at me, silently watching me. My uneasy feeling turned into scared and then stress. I was so uneasy that I whispered to myself, "Something bad's going to happen, I just know it." The floor started rumbling as though someone was running on it, running up behind me as my back was turned away from the entry to the kitchen. It rumbled so hard the pounding of the footsteps was so loud, I didn't know what to expect, and I put my hands over my ears to block out the sound. It ran up behind me, and it slammed me into the kitchen counter, leaving a large purple bruise on my stomach. As soon as it all started, it stopped. Nothing but silence in the small kitchen again. While checking my stomach, I waited to see if anything else was going to happen, but nothing did. The room fell quiet once again. I started panicking, feeling so scared about what had just happened. I finally got the courage to turn around, and as I did, I sighed in relief. My big-eyed pupper was sitting in the doorway, staring up at me. I walked over to her and hugged her, then hooked her up to a leash to take her out before I went to bed. At this point, it was about 12, and I was so scared and exhausted from that experience, I just decided it was the sleep my body was desperately craving but hadn't received, causing me to think something happened when it really didn't. Though it doesn't explain the bruise forming on my stomach. I said to my pupper, "Hard to believe that my mind could conjure up something so scary." She was hooked up and we walked outside onto the porch. Normally we have 4 baby stray cats that basically live out there, but they were nowhere in sight, so I assumed that they took cover at the neighbor's house. I walked the little pupper into the yard a little ways away from the side of the house where the kitchen window was. Now, I wasn't in front of the kitchen window. I was at the front of the yard, but I could see the kitchen window from where I stood. I looked down and talked to my dog, telling her what a good girl she is and how beautiful she looked, what all puppy mamas do. She looked up at me and wagged her tail in delight, but then her mood suddenly changed, as she then snapped her neck to where the kitchen window was. When I say snapped, I mean she turned her head so fast I for real thought that she was going to break her neck. It startled me so much that I naturally took a couple of steps backward, trying to calm down from the scare. I glanced over to where she was looking. Just a small, quick glance, and to my surprise, I actually saw something. I wasn't expecting to see anything, so I had a double take at the sight of this thing. We both sat and stared, trying to see what it was. It looked like a black silhouette, probably about 7, maybe 8 feet tall, with a very large chest. I remember the chest so well because it stuck out so far, like scarily far. The figure looked thin in the face, but quite large in the rest of the body. It was staring over the large hedge that was in front of our kitchen window. It was staring into the window, like it was waiting, silently for someone or something to move inside of the house. I'm guessing my dog's eyes finally adjusted to the darkness because she let out a small woof at the creature. As soon as she did this, the creature turned its head and stared at me with huge green eyes. My heart sank. The way its eyes were reflecting the light made me instantly think that what I was standing in front of was a giant 7 to 8 foot tall animal. It was silent, no sound, no nothing. I was so focused on the creature that I had failed to realize that the night's insects had gone silent as well. There was no noise except for the static around the energy coming from the city. I froze while my puppies started barking loudly and violently. What could this be? Am I seeing things? Is this real? I scooped my pup in my arms and ran inside the house, all the while feeling the same pounding and hearing the loud thudding footsteps as the previous encounter that took place an hour earlier. I ran so fast that I almost tripped over my own feet. I darted indoors, basically tossed my pooch on the couch and locked the door as fast as I could. Leaning against the door, I listened for whatever it was that chased us in. I almost held the door closed, thinking it would actually do something to protect us from that thing. All I could hear was the sound of heavy breaths from running so fast. My dog barking must have disturbed my family because my mother came out of her room and saw me holding the door closed. She saw that I was distressed and wrapped her arms around me, telling me everything was okay, and asked what happened. I couldn't get out the story. For some reason, my mind told me not to tell her because I knew she wouldn't believe me. So I made up a story about how one of the neighbors startled me and assured her that I was okay. To this day, she still doesn't know the story. None of my family does. And I still don't know what that creature was. But I do know one thing about it, that it will haunt my mind for a long, long time. The experience that I'm about to recount is one of the most terrifying incidents that's ever happened to me. At the time of this encounter, I was 17 years old, and my family decided to visit our cottage for a weekend during the warm months of July. Before I continue, I would just like to specify that I am female. My family's cottage is deep within the countryside of Ontario, Canada. I had recently lost a lot of weight because I had taken up the habit of going on long walks every afternoon, and I wasn't going to let staying at the cottage ruin my new routine. One evening, I decided to go for a walk a couple of hours after dinner, just as the sun was setting. Now that I'm older, I realize how foolish this idea was. For context, my family's cottage is in a rural area. There are barely any cars, no streetlights, and the area is heavily wooded on both sides of the skinny one-lane road that stretches for kilometers in both directions. At the beginning of my walk, it was still somewhat bright outside, and I decided to call my friend while I was out to help pass the time. Looking back, I guess I must have been so engrossed in conversation that I didn't realize how quickly the sun was setting. Before I knew it, the sun was almost completely gone. By this point, I was 30 minutes away from my family's cottage by foot. During my walk, I only saw about 2 cars pass the entire time that I was out. Eventually, I told my friend that I was heading back because of how dark it had gotten. Just as I turned around the long stretch of road, I saw an old beat-up pickup truck coming down the lane. At first, I didn't think anything of it. In fact, I even made a joke to my friend over the phone that wouldn't it be hilarious that that pickup truck ended up turning around? In hindsight, that was an extremely stupid comment to make. The pickup truck sped down the road and out of sight. However, about 5 minutes later, before I knew it, it must have pulled into somebody's driveway and made a U-turn because it was coming right towards me. Not trying to hit me, but just traveling in the opposite direction down the road. I was a little bit perturbed, but I didn't initially think that anything was wrong or amiss. After all, there was a small convenience store that you could probably get to in the same amount of time if you sped like a maniac. So, naive 17-year-old me just brushed it off. But things soon took a turn for the worst. Not even 5 minutes later, the old pickup truck turned around again, and this time it was clear that the driver had decreased the speed enough to get a good look at me through the window. This time I totally freaked out. I told my friend about the incident and was panicking. I've read way too many let's not meet stories on Reddit to know where this was going. I told my friend over the phone what was happening, and she told me to hang up and call my dad, who was at the cottage with the rest of my family. I did as she said, and soon after I saw the truck make a U-turn in someone's driveway and come back in my direction again. The truck passed me once more, but each time it did, its speed decreased, which set me on edge and made me feel uncomfortable. After all of these years, I still can't fully describe the sheer amount of panic that I felt on that summer evening. Right before I called my dad, I was trying to figure out my next course of action. There were woods on either side of the street. I decided that if the truck came back round and if the driver attempted to get out and pursue me, I would make a run for the woods in order to get as far away from them as I could. I finally called my dad and told him what was going on. I couldn't help but almost cry. He asked me for directions. I told him if he made a right from their cottage and kept on driving for about 5 minutes or so, that he would eventually spot me. By now it was pitch black outside. The only source of light I had was the moon and my iPhone's flashlight. During this time, the truck made another turn and once again drove by me extremely slowly. This time it drove up a couple of rural driveways down the road, and I saw that it was idling with its headlights off. At that moment in time, I didn't care if I was overreacting. I genuinely thought that whoever was in that truck was planning on abducting me. I've read countless stories online and watched way too many documentaries to know where this situation could potentially lead me. Luckily, just as I was losing hope, I saw the headlights of another car approaching. My phone rang. It was my dad. He flashed his headlights twice, and I bolted as fast as my legs could take me over to his car. The problem was, in order to make it to his car, I had to pass the driveway that the old truck was parked in. This was a moment that I just winged. I didn't care. I just thought to myself, if I run as quickly as possible, I'll make it. And if someone gets out of the truck and chases me, I'll run into the woods. Looking back, who knows if that idea would have lost me my life. I took the risk and made it past the truck and finally to my dad's car. I opened the door and got into the front seat, breathing heavily. My dad was glad to know that I was safe, and I was glad to see him. At first I thought we were going to start the car and bolt right out of there, but my dad wanted to do a test. He parked his car and turned off the headlights. He told me he wanted to see if the truck driver I described would try and make a run for it, or at least try to continue the search for me. After 5 minutes, it was clear that the truck driver was smarter than we thought, as the vehicle remained hidden. We drove back to the cottage and called the cops. There wasn't much they could do because I didn't catch the plate, and technically the driver hadn't done anything to me. And looking back, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a local concern that a young girl was walking alone at night. I still don't know. But I do know one thing. The events that transpired that night didn't set well with me. My gut told me everything I needed to know. Better safe than sorry. And I want anyone who's reading this to know that no matter how silly you feel about any situation, always trust your gut. My uncle was always my grandpa's favorite. As a young boy, my uncle's grandpa would always sneak him treats and get him to come help him with any chores that needed doing around the farm. His grandpa would always wear one of those peak caps, like the ones in the show Peaky Blinders with the razor blades in them. So when his grandpa passed when he was in his late teens, he kept the hat as something to remember him by and still has it today. My uncle was a diesel mechanic and spent most of the late 80s working in the mines in outback Australia on all the excavators and dump trucks, etc. The way it worked at most of these mines at the time, being that they're so remote, is he would come in for 2 to 3 weeks and then after that would go home for a week or two. My uncle had just finished up one of these few week-long shifts and was driving home, which was about 400 kilometers away, so he had a long drive ahead. The roads in the outback are very empty and distance between towns can be about 50 kilometers plus. Given that information, my uncle would often travel at well above the speed limit on his way home to try and cut back the time it would take to get home. As he was starting to head around a large bend, he saw an old man standing in the road with his arm outstretched in a stop motion, with his head down and a peak cap, just like his grandpa used to wear, masking the top of his face. My uncle slammed on the brakes and came to a stop about 5 meters from the man, and after the initial shock of nearly running this guy down wore off, my uncle thought it was odd that an old man would be out in the middle of the Australian desert by himself. His initial thought was that the old man's car had broken down or something similar. He got out and asked the old man if he needed help and told him that he shouldn't be standing in the middle of the road going around a bend as people might not see him in time. But the old man didn't say a word and remained in the same position, arm out and face down. After my uncle had finished saying this, a mob of kangaroos came out of the bush and jumped across the road behind where my uncle's car had came to a stop. He had turned around to see what the noise was, and when he turned back to where the old man was, he was gone. My uncle called out and started to search for the man, but couldn't find any sign of him. Eventually he got into his car and decided to drive up the road a bit further to see if there was a car broken down or anything that could explain why the old man was there. He slowly rounded the bend and was met with a large tree that had fallen across the road. He said that if he hadn't stopped, at the speed that he was going at, he would have had no hope of stopping before he crashed head first into it. To this day he swears it was his grandpa that had slowed him down and stopped him from an almost certain death. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, when the time comes, you gotta keep writing and don't look back.